this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities of sovereignty, which have now passed to my beloved daughter.
Britain woke to a royal shock no one saw coming. King Charles had signed an emergency proclamation naming Catherine Queen Regent of Britain. But this was not just a title. It was a warning. Behind palace walls, panic had already begun, and the one woman long seen as graceful, patient, and silent was suddenly placed at the center of the monarchy's most dangerous power shift. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The proclamation did not arrive like a celebration. It landed like a thunderclap. One moment, the monarchy was trying to appear steady, controlled, and untouchable. The next, Catherine's name was being placed above expectations that had shaped royal life for generations. This was not a soft adjustment. This was a sudden transfer of symbolic power, wrapped in emergency language and sealed with the authority of the king himself. Inside the palace, aides who were trained to stay calm reportedly struggled to hide their shock. Some had expected a statement. Some had expected reassurance. No one expected Catherine to be named Queen Regent of Britain with such speed, such force, and such finality. And that was what made it feel dangerous. Because when the crown moves quickly, it usually means something has already gone wrong behind closed doors. William, standing closest to the storm, was caught in the cruelest position of all. As a son, he had to respect his father's command. As a future king, he had to understand the need for stability. But as a husband, he could see the weight being placed on Catherine's shoulders before the world even understood it. This was not only about royal duty. It was about pressure, fear, and the possibility that Catherine was being pushed into the center of a crisis she had not created. Meanwhile, Camilla's circle was said to be blindsided. The decision had not simply elevated Catherine, it had shifted the emotional balance of the monarchy. Suddenly, every whisper returned to the same question. Why Catherine? Why now? And why with such urgency? The public began searching for answers before the palace could control the meaning of the announcement. Was Charles protecting the crown from a hidden threat? Was he preparing Britain for a deeper royal emergency? Or had he finally admitted that Catherine, not anyone else, was the only figure strong enough to steady the nation? The title sounded majestic, but beneath it was something colder. A warning. A fracture. A secret waiting to rise. But the proclamation was only the surface because the real drama began hours before Charles signed his name. Long before the nation heard Catherine's new title, a private meeting unfolded behind closed palace doors. No cameras, no speeches, no smiling portraits, only urgent voices, locked rooms, and a decision so explosive it could not be delayed until morning. And at the center of it all stood King Charles, facing the one choice that could save the crown or tear it apart. The proclamation the public later saw was clean, formal, and carefully worded, but the hours before it were anything but calm. Senior advisors were summoned without warning, and the silence around those calls said more than any statement ever could. These were not routine discussions. This was not another royal briefing wrapped in polite phrases. This was emergency control, the kind that begins when the palace fears the story is already slipping from its hands. Charles was reportedly warned that the monarchy needed immediate stability, not in days, not after another round of family talks, but now. The crown, they believed, could not survive another wave of uncertainty without a clear figure placed at the center. And that figure, against every old expectation, was Catherine. William understood the danger, but he did not rush toward it. He argued for caution, because he knew what this kind of power could do to the woman he loved. Catherine had already carried years of pressure with quiet discipline, but this was different. To name her Queen Regent was to place her above whispers, rivalries, and palace resentment. It was to turn her from a symbol of grace into the living shield of the monarchy. Catherine herself did not accept the idea easily. Her reluctance made the room heavier, because it proved she understood the cost. She was not reaching for authority. she was being pulled toward it. And that difference mattered. The emergency language was chosen carefully, not to inspire celebration, but to justify speed. Every word had to sound official enough to silence doubt, yet serious enough to explain why normal royal order had suddenly been bent. Still, behind that polished language, a hidden divide began to show. Some believed Catherine was the only person with enough public trust to steady Britain. Others feared this move would humiliate those who had spent years guarding their influence, and in that split, the true danger appeared. Charles was not only naming a regent, he was choosing a side in a palace struggle that had been building quietly for years. William could feel the future shifting beneath him. Catherine could feel the burden closing in. And Charles, perhaps more than anyone, knew that once his signature touched the proclamation, there would be no easy return. Yet Catherine's hesitation made the moment even more powerful, because she knew this was not honor, it was burden. Catherine had spent years mastering calm, but this was different. Being named Queen Regent did not feel like victory. It felt like stepping into a storm built by secrets, rivalries, and expectations no one else could carry. Those close to her sensed it immediately. Beneath the composed face was a woman who understood that the crown had just placed a target on her back. For years, Catherine had survived royal pressure by staying steady, choosing silence when others wanted reaction, choosing duty when the world demanded emotion. But this title changed the rules. It was no longer enough to be admired. Now she had to lead through uncertainty, absorb blame before it arrived, and protect a monarchy that had placed its deepest fear in her hands. The honor sounded grand from the outside, but inside the family, it carried a dangerous message. Catherine had been trusted above others, and that trust could cut like a blade. Her first fear was not for herself, it was for the family. She knew this proclamation could divide the palace into those who saw her as the crown's last hope, and those who saw her as a threat. Every word of praise could become another wound. Every show of confidence from Charles could deepen resentment. And above all, she feared what this storm could do to her children, who had already grown up under the weight of royal expectation. Catherine understood that palace conflict never stays with adults alone. It spreads through whispers, cold glances, careful exclusions, and silent loyalties. That was the part that hurt most. William became her anchor in that moment, not with loud promises, but with the kind of quiet strength that reminded her she was not entering the storm alone. Yet even he could not remove the burden. His support could steady her, but it could not erase the truth that Catherine now stood in a role shaped by power, politics, and sacrifice. Publicly, she would have to appear strong enough to calm the nation. Privately, she had every reason to feel uncertain. That contrast made her rise more gripping. The woman everyone saw as graceful was being forced into a sharper, heavier form of leadership, one where every decision would be studied, every silence judged, and every move compared against those who felt pushed aside. And somewhere beneath it all was a darker question. Catherine could not ignore. Why had Charles truly chosen her? Was it only because she was trusted, or because he knew a crisis was coming that no one else could survive? The answer had not yet been spoken, but Catherine could feel it moving closer, hidden beneath the polished words of the proclamation. And while Catherine wrestled with duty, another royal figure saw the proclamation as something far more personal. For Camilla, the proclamation was not just surprising, it was humiliating. Catherine had not simply been elevated, she had been positioned above the palace's old power structure. In one signature, Charles had shifted the future away from familiar hands and toward the woman many already saw as the monarchy's safest hope. And that realization sent silence through the Queen's closest circle. The shock was not only in what Charles had done, but in what he had not done. He had not prepared every corner of the palace for the announcement. He had not allowed old loyalties to soften the blow. He had not given Camilla's side the comfort of feeling included in a decision that touched the very soul of the crown. That absence spoke loudly. Suddenly, influence that once felt secure appeared fragile, and the quiet confidence around Camilla began to crack. Her advisors struggled to understand the motive behind Charles's choice. Was this a temporary emergency measure, or had the king finally decided that Catherine represented the future more clearly than anyone else? The question carried a sting, because Catherine's rise did not look like a normal promotion. It looked like a public signal that trust had moved elsewhere. Old tensions began to return, the kind that had been hidden under polite smiles and careful royal language. Generational loyalties, private frustrations, and years of whispered comparison came rushing back into the palace air. Catherine had become the emotional face of national stability, and that made her powerful in a way no formal title could fully explain. People did not simply respect her, they believed in her calm. They saw her as steady, protective, and untouched by the sharper games of palace politics. That public trust became her armor, but also her weapon, even if she never asked for it. For Camilla, the deeper wound was exclusion. A decision involving the crown itself had unfolded around her, not through her. That kind of silence can feel more brutal than open conflict, because it suggests the battle has already been fought elsewhere. And once that realization settled in, suspicion began to grow. Some wondered whether Charles had acted against internal resistance, pushing the proclamation forward before anyone could slow it down, challenge it, or reshape it. If that was true, then Catherine's appointment was not just an emergency decision. It was a royal power move. A line had been drawn, and everyone inside the family could feel it. Catherine may have been carrying the burden, but Camilla was facing the insult. And in a monarchy built on rank, closeness, and control, insult can become dangerous very quickly. The palace had tried to present unity, but beneath the surface, a colder truth was forming. Not everyone would accept Catherine's rise quietly. But Camilla was not the only one shaken. William now faced a crisis no heir could ignore. Prince William had prepared his whole life for responsibility, but not like this. His wife had been placed into a role that changed everything, while his father's authority appeared fragile and urgent. Supporting Catherine meant protecting the future. Questioning the move meant challenging the king. And for William, every path forward carried the risk of betrayal. The proclamation forced him into 3 roles at once, and each one demanded a different kind of loyalty. As a husband, he wanted to shield Catherine from the anger that would surely come from those who felt threatened by her rise. As a son, he could not ignore the weight behind Charles's decision or the fear that may have pushed his father into such a dramatic step. As heir, he had to think beyond emotion and ask what this meant for the crown itself. That was the trap. William could understand the need for stability and still fear the cost. He could trust Catherine completely and still question why the decision had moved so fast. Behind the careful royal silence, he privately wrestled with the speed of it all. Emergency language may have justified the proclamation, but it did not erase the danger. Catherine would now become the face of every palace success and the target of every palace failure. If the family appeared stronger, people would praise Charles's wisdom. But if the old tensions exploded, Catherine could be blamed for dividing a house that was already cracking. That thought haunted William more than any public criticism. He knew how easily loyalty inside the palace could turn cold, how quickly whispers could become weapons, and how often the person carrying the burden is later accused of creating it. So William began to move with quiet purpose, not against Charles, but around Catherine. He started forming a protective circle, not built on loud confrontation, but on trust, discretion, and absolute control over who could reach her, advise her, or pressure her. This was no longer simply a marriage under royal duty. It was a partnership sharpened by crisis. Catherine had become the monarchy's shield, and William became the guard standing closest to it. Yet even that protection could not soften the emotional wound. His loyalty to Charles was being tested in a way no ceremony could prepare him for. To support the proclamation was to accept that his father had acted decisively, perhaps wisely. But to question it was to admit that Charles may have placed Catherine in danger to save the crown. That possibility changed everything between father and son. The proclamation did not break William and Catherine. It fused them into something stronger, more cautious, and far more aware of the forces moving around them. And as William looked beyond the shock, beyond Camilla's silence, beyond Catherine's burden, one truth began to rise from the shadows. Yet the deeper William looked, the clearer it became that Charles had not acted from impulse alone. The palace wanted the world to believe this was about stability, but whispers suggested something deeper. Charles had seen the fractures, the rivalries, the fading public trust, and the dangerous uncertainty surrounding the monarchy's next chapter. Catherine was not chosen because she was convenient. She was chosen because, in Charles's mind, she may have been the only one left who could hold Britain's faith. That was the truth William began to sense, as the shock settled into something colder. Charles had not moved quickly because he was careless. He had moved quickly because delay had become dangerous. The monarchy was not only fighting public doubt, it was fighting itself. Behind the polished statements, there were tensions that no speech could hide forever, loyalties pulling in different directions, and a growing fear that the crown needed one trusted figure before the cracks became impossible to cover. Catherine had something others did not. She had quiet belief. Not just popularity, not just admiration, but a kind of emotional trust that could calm people before explanations arrived. Charles understood that power. He knew Catherine's calm image could become a national shield, a way to tell Britain that the monarchy still had a steady hand, even if the family behind it was trembling. The proclamation was framed as protection for the crown, but protection from what was the question no one could answer openly. Was it fear of internal resistance? A hidden royal emergency? A crisis of leadership? Or the possibility that without Catherine, the public would lose faith in the institution itself? Every possibility made the decision feel more serious. Catherine's popularity had suddenly become political royal power, and that kind of power can frighten even those who claim to welcome it. She had not demanded influence, yet influence had gathered around her because people trusted what she represented. Duty without noise, strength without cruelty, grace without weakness. Charles saw that and chose it, perhaps not because he wanted to change the future, but because he feared the future was already changing without him. Still, the decision carried a shadow. If Catherine was truly the only one who could hold Britain's faith, what did that say about everyone else? That question was dangerous enough to unsettle the palace. Hidden fears about unity began to surface, and every private conversation seemed to circle back to the same unspoken warning: Charles knew more than he had revealed. His proclamation did not feel like the end of a crisis. It felt like the beginning of one. Catherine had been placed at the center for a reason, and William now understood that the reason might be bigger, darker, and closer than anyone dared admit. But the public response would turn this private royal gamble into a national earthquake. Once the proclamation reached the public, Britain split between awe, confusion, and disbelief. Supporters called Catherine the steady hand the monarchy desperately needed. Critics demanded answers. Royal watchers searched every word for hidden meaning, and inside the palace, the reaction was being watched with fear, because if the people embraced Catherine too strongly, the old order might never recover. The announcement did not fade after the first wave of shock. It grew louder. Every conversation seemed to return to Catherine, to Charles, to the strange urgency behind the proclamation. People who had once followed royal events casually were suddenly asking serious questions. Why had this happened so quickly? Why had Catherine been chosen above every familiar figure? And why did the palace sound calm while the decision itself felt like alarm? Across royal circles, Catherine was praised as calm, dignified, and trustworthy. But that praise carried a hidden danger. The more the public celebrated her, the more isolated other figures appeared. Her strength became a mirror, and not everyone liked what it reflected. Questions about Charles's condition and control began spreading almost immediately. If he was fully secure, why name a queen regent with emergency force? If everything was stable, why did the palace need such a dramatic shield? The public may not have had answers, but they understood pressure when they saw it. Camilla's absence from the center of the announcement only deepened the suspicion. Silence, in royal life, is never empty. It can be protection, punishment, or proof that something has gone wrong. And in this moment, her distance from the proclamation became one of the most talked about details. Then came William's silence, perhaps even more powerful. He did not rush to explain. He did not soften the shock with easy words. His restraint made people wonder whether he was protecting Catherine, obeying Charles, or privately measuring the danger ahead. Inside the palace, that public reaction was studied with growing concern. Catherine was no longer only admired, she was becoming unmatched. Her name carried emotional authority. Her calm carried political weight. Her role, once framed as emergency service, was beginning to look like the start of a new royal order, and that was exactly what frightened the old structure. Because when people place their faith in one figure, the balance of power changes without needing permission. Catherine had not seized anything, yet trust had moved toward her with stunning speed. The palace wanted control, but the nation had already begun writing its own meaning into the proclamation. Charles's gamble had worked too well, and now even victory felt dangerous. And just as the palace tried to control the story, Catherine prepared for the moment that would define her reign. Catherine's first move as Queen Regent would decide everything. If she appeared too weak, the palace factions would close in. If she appeared too strong, she could be accused of taking power too quickly. But Catherine understood the truth. This was no longer about ceremony. It was about survival, legacy, and whether the monarchy could endure the secrets now rising from within. She accepted the burden with controlled strength, not as someone chasing power, but as someone realizing that refusal could leave the crown exposed. Her first message was unity, yet beneath that calm wording was a quiet assertion of authority. Catherine was not asking permission to steady the monarchy. She was stepping into the role Charles had forced into history, and every careful word made clear that she understood the weight of it. William stood behind her, steady and watchful, but even his support could not hide the pressure surrounding them. The partnership that had once been admired for grace was now being tested by crisis, suspicion, and the dangerous politics of survival. Catherine knew every faction would study her first move. Camilla's next response remained uncertain, and that uncertainty hung over the palace like unfinished business. Would she accept Catherine's rise for the sake of unity, or would silence become the first sign of resistance? No one knew. But what everyone understood was this: Charles's proclamation had opened a new royal era, and there was no simple way to close it again. Catherine had become more than a symbol. She had become the point where public trust, family tension, and royal power collided. The old order could no longer pretend nothing had changed. Every private rivalry, every hidden fear, every question about Charles's true reason for acting so suddenly now seemed to lead back to her. And perhaps that was the greatest danger of all. Catherine may soon have to reveal what the palace had tried to bury beneath ceremony. She may have to explain why the emergency was so urgent, why Charles chose her above all others, and why the monarchy had needed a shield before the storm even broke. Her rise looked graceful to the outside world, but inside the crown, it felt like the opening of a sealed door. What waited behind it could change everything. And as Britain watched its new Queen Regent rise, one chilling question remained: what emergency was so serious that Charles had no choice but to hand Catherine the crown's future? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.